Well, hello everyone. We have a special guest today, and not a stranger to this channel, and a person who admire and respect dearly for the work that he's done on a number of different books and over the years politically, and in particular around Alberta and sovereignty. Today we are going to talk with Dr. Michael Wagner, who is an author. One of the books we're going to discuss today is this lovely book here. I was told to show it because I have this tendency of, Michael will appreciate this as a professor, right? All the footnotes and the markings. And of course, he lives in Edmonton with his wife and 11 children, which I think personally has got to be your greatest accomplishment. I have one, not through lack of trying, it just worked out that way, but I thought maybe three would have been ambitious. 11 is just incredible. But today's book is called Leaving God Behind, and I just want to read the back cover because there's a reason there's all these sticky notes in here. The back cover itself is a great introduction. All countries have a religious foundation, and all law is based on a world view or religious perspective. For Canada, the religious foundation was Christianity. Now, with that in mind, I want to welcome Dr. Michael Wagner because that one statement alone, wow, that's got to get a few shackles up from a number of different people. So, Michael, when you wrote this book, what's the feedback been, the response been on a statement like that?
Actually, for the most part, it's been negative feedback. I really haven't received, like, in recent last couple of years, I've received more positive feedback. But early on, a lot of people didn't like the book at all, and especially because in the preamble to the charter, it says that Canada is founded upon principles that recognize God and the rule of law, and people just assume that because the word God is in the preamble, that therefore the charter itself is somehow Christian. Whereas the book itself, the whole theme of the book, is to show how the charter undermined Canada's Christian foundation, because that's what it actually did. And so I found that people were kind of critical or hesitant to take a look at the book because they thought the charter was so good. That's the thing. So many Canadians in recent decades think the charter is this wonderful document that gives us our freedom, and it doesn't. We were better before the charter. In fact, before the charter was enacted, Canada was still one of the freest and most prosperous countries in world history. And Trudeau brought it along and was able to convince enough people to enact it. And now people think, well, there's something wrong with Canada before the charter, and there wasn't. And people have too positive a view of the charter. And so a major impact part of that book is to explain how the charter undermined Canada's original foundation and how harmful that has been, because I want people to understand the charter has not been a good thing for Canada. And because so many people do have a positive impression of the charter, that's led to the kind of that negative impression of the book for many people.
Well, for me, the charter was a big deal, right? And it was supposed to be about protecting our rights. And this was supposed to be some sort of oversight that just didn't happen and should have happened. And they made such fanfare about it. And then when I read your book, I just went, oh my Lord, like this makes so much sense. And after COVID in particular, to see how they just, whoof, charter rights, freedoms, who cares? Right? And the courts, which you explain this so eloquently in here, you are so articulate with your words. It's amazing. And yeah, I know I'm kind of, but it's true. It's so true. This book, it's such a small book, really, just 100 and some pages, but, cut out the fluff, cut out the filler, and here's the facts. And I mean, that's why I have so many stickies on here, because there are so many great little one line or a paragraph that just hits the nail right dead center. And so I want to talk because Alberta is looking at amending its Bill of Rights. And I want to talk a little bit about how maybe Alberta might be able to challenge some of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, because in particular, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms omits property rights. And as we read in your book here, we know that that was done deliberately, as was the Charter itself. So why don't you give us a quick synopsis as to your statement that Canada is a Christian nation, or at least it was a Christian nation.
Yeah, well, in Leaving God Behind, there's three major examples that I use to show that Canada was a Christian nation. And in each case, in each of those examples, it's the charter that overturned the important aspect, the important Christian law or policy that we had. The first one is the Lord's Day Act, which was enacted in 1906. Canada's House of Commons enacted a law to protect Sunday from certain business activities and sporting activities, because in Christianity that Sunday is the Lord's Day, which is a special day where people kind of rest from their normal labors. That's the Christian concept. So that was enacted by the Parliament in 1906, and it stayed in effect until it was uprooted by the Charter in 1985. But the fact that Canada had a specific law to enact the Christian Lord's Day is a very strong very strong example of Christian influence on Canadian politics. Now, the second example I use is Christian influence in Ontario public schools. Now, the reason I use Ontario is because in Canada, education is a provincial responsibility, so you have to look at each province individually. And Ontario, being the biggest province, it had the biggest impact in a sense. It also had there was so much evidence about the Christian impact of or influence on education policy in Ontario. Like right from the beginning of Ontario's public education system in the early 1800s, there was Christian influence. It even got a bit stronger in the 20th century, and that remained. Like there was two aspects to that Christian influence. One is what are called religious exercises, and that's like opening or closing exercises where you have prayer and Bible reading. So that's one component. The other component is actual religious content, like teaching of Christian content. So Ontario had both of those in their regulations, educational regulations, until late 1980s, when they were struck down as a result of the charter. They were struck down by the Ontario Court of Appeal because of the charter. So, by the 80s, some of the public schools weren't actually following those regulations, but some of the ones, especially in rural areas, were, and they would have stayed in place, except that they were struck down because of the charter. But when you have explicit Christian influences in an public education system, it says something about that culture, about that society. You have a particular religious influence in the education. It shows that religion has influenced that culture. So those are the two examples so far. The final example is Canada's definition of marriage. Like until 2003, Canada's definition of marriage was an explicitly Christian definition of marriage. It was a carryover from Britain. There had been a court decision in Britain in the 1800s about what marriage is, and it was an explicitly Christian definition. And so when Canada became an independent country, that was the definition we had, and it was struck down by the Ontario Court of Appeal in 2003. Now, 2 years later, of course, it was changed by the House of Commons, but it's nevertheless the first undermining of the definition of marriage was the Ontario Court of Appeal on the basis of the Charter. So these are three major examples of Christian influence in Canada, and in each case, they were struck down as a direct result of the Charter being implemented by Pierre Trudeau. That's kind of a nutshell view of the book.
The nutshell. Now, you left out all the best juicy parts. We're going to get into those because
Sure, yeah, yeah,
yeah, because what you talk about here is the fact that every country is founded basically on a set of morals, right? A set of
yeah,
principles. And what you're
yeah.
saying, it's either Canada was set on Christian values, a Christian set of principles, morals, and that what happened in with the adoption of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we kind of abandoned that and went into this, you call it human secularism, right?
Yeah.
And so, I love the fact that you say, like, because the universe abhors a void, right? If it's not filled with one thing, it's got to be
Yeah,
filled with something. And so, with
right.
law in particular, when it abandoned Christianity as its foundation, it had to replace it with something. So, and every society, and I love this because you point this out again in the book about every society picks its moral standard of what is right and what is wrong. And we
Hmm.
had chosen the Christian standard of what is right and what is wrong. And when we threw that
Right.
out, basically Canada became a different country.
Yes.
And
Yes,
so
that's exactly right.
explain then after 1982 how the implementation of the charter changed, because that's where multiculturalism really took off, I think, in Canada, and it did change us as a country.
Yeah, well, actually, multiculturalism is written directly into the charter. There's a provision in the charter, I can't remember the exact section, that says the entire charter must be interpreted in light of Canada's multicultural history. And that is especially significant, like I mentioned earlier, the preamble where it mentioned God. The Supreme Court, interprets God in the preamble in light of the provision that says it has to be interpreted in light of multiculturalism. So they see that God in the preamble not as the Christian God, which is what most people would think, but the courts see it as the multicultural God, which is a generic God that applies to every religion and not specifically to Christianity. So in court cases where Christians have tried to use the God in the preamble as a leverage, in their legal arguments, the courts have said no, that's not the Christian God. That's a generic God, so you can't use that in argumentation, based on the charter. But like you said, I mean, the charter completely changed Canada's constitution from the way it had been before. Before the charter, we had a system that was called basically parliamentary supremacy. So elected officials were ultimately, the supreme determiners of policy in Canada, and the charter brought in what's called constitutional supremacy, but what really is judicial supremacy, where in many cases the Supreme Court becomes the highest authority in terms of policy in Canada. So many laws, as we've discussed, have been struck down as a result of the courts getting this power from the charter. And this was not a mistake. Like I know a lot of people think, well, the judges used the charter on their own as an opportunity to take power, and maybe there's some of that, but it was Trudeau's intent to transfer power from elected officials to the judges. And he wrote that, I forgot to bring the book with me here, but in 1968, when Pierre Trudeau was the justice minister, he wrote a book which was it was a proposal for the Charter of Rights for Canada. It was published by the government of Canada in 1968, and he says right in there that one of the implications of this is we'll have to transfer some power we'll have to switch from parliamentary supremacy to something else, which is we have to transfer some of the power from elected officials to unelected officials. That was the intent of it, right, in 1968 when he wrote that. And throughout, the charter itself wasn't adopted officially till 1981. It came into effect in 1982. But during those 13 years, there was a lot of debate over the charter, and often you'd have hearings where political scientists or law professors would come before parliamentarians and say, if you adopt this charter, we're going to be transferring power from elected officials to the judges. They would say that. This was not some kind of a secret thing. Like throughout the 70s, you can go back and read these transcripts of these parliamentary hearings. This was public information of argumentation against the charter. But somehow, it seems to have been missed in the major debates in 1981. The Trudeau Liberals were just kind of, selling it as, don't you want more freedoms? Don't you want a document that protects you from the government? And of course, we want a document that protects us from the government. Who doesn't want that, right? So it's an easy sell. It's an easy sell, but there was so much behind it, that had been spoken out publicly but wasn't part of their selling point. You know what I mean? So it was easy to make the charter popular. And when they took polls, the charter had a majority support in Canada at that time because of this thing. Of course, we want protection from the government, but there was so much more to it than what they were saying, in terms of their sales pitch. And of course, most of the premiers were opposed to the charter. They saw, and especially Sterling Lyon, the premier of Manitoba, he spoke out very strongly against the charter because he knew it was going to undermine our system that we had. And you know what? The leftists accused him of being against human rights. This would be their thing. If you don't support the Charter of Rights, you're against human rights. You know what I mean? It's that kind of a thing. And so it puts the premiers, and especially conservative premiers like Sterling Lyon, on the defensive. It makes them look like they're being the bad guy. You know what I mean? But so anyway, they were able to sell the charter in this way, and people were able to buy into it. Although there were always critics of it, like conservative critics throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. I could say that criticism has died off now. But if you don't mind my mentioning, I'll just in my new book, Time to Leave, I've got a section in there. Like there's, Leaving God Behind is a specifically Christian critique of the charter. But in Time to Leave, which is an argument about Alberta independence, I have a section there that's not a specifically Christian argument against the charter, but an argument based on the lack of property rights, because Pierre Trudeau deliberately took property rights out of the charter proposal. And one of the main leaders in opposition to the charter was a lady named Dr. Ruth Gorman, who was a famous Alberta lawyer. And she traveled around the province speaking against the charter, very strongly opposed to it, and writing, columns for the Edmonton Journal and the Calgary Herald, trying to help people to understand that because the property rights were deliberately omitted from the charter, then the charter would actually not be protecting us as individuals the way we should be protected. Because historically in English-speaking nations, as John Locke would say, you have protections for life, liberty, and property. Those are kind of like the three basic rights in throughout the English-speaking countries. But then Trudeau's charter would protect life and liberty, but not property. So you're reducing the number of the areas where you're protected by the Constitution. So it was a deliberate reduction of protections, for individuals from the government. And so Ruth Gorman, like, as she was part of the Western Canada Concept Party, she was actually one of the founders and wrote the Constitution. She was very involved in the campaign for Alberta independence as a way of protecting us from Pierre Trudeau's charter. And, it's important to keep in mind too, that was at the time of the National Energy Program where Trudeau was, trying to take control of our energy industry. And Dr. Ruth Gorman saw it in that context, that he's already trying to take control. Imagine once he gets property rights out of the Constitution, imagine what he can do then. You know what I mean? So it was very scary. And of course, we did end up with a situation with less property rights. It's not that we don't have any property rights. It's just that they're not protected the way that other fundamental rights are. And so their protections are restricted. So there is all these different reasons for seeing that there's problems with the charter. It's not a good document, and we would have been better off without it.
Yeah, I did read Time to Leave as well, which is another fantastic book. Certainly recommend it. And it was page 55 and 56 actually that talked about the loss of property rights once protected by the Magna Carta, deliberately omitted from the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I think you touched on that in particular because Trudeau Sr. was a lawyer. Graduated at Harvard, right? Has traveled the world. He's known to be very communist, Marxist in his thinking, admired Cuba, went to Russia. At one point, was, blacklisted, not allowed into the United States because he was a communist. And people say, and this is a little bit of a scary thing for me because I think about this and I think about the slippery slide that Canada has found itself as far as the trajectory of morals and its standing in the world even. And it really started, I think, honestly, with Pierre Elliott Trudeau, much of it. And, we did have the Bill of Rights, that Diefenbaker put in, very simple, very clearly stated. We knew where we stood. I am a free person. I have the right to speak, a right to protection from my own government. And the charter is not clearly written in that same manner. So, when I look at this, but I want to talk and explore this a little bit with you because you're a professor of political science, right? I mean, you've been involved politically.
Actually, like, I'm not a professor. Actually, I'm an independent researcher and writer. I've got a PhD in political science, but I'm not a professor. So,
Okay, doctor. If they call for you on the airplane, don't pick him. Um, but the PhD in political science, and you've been a big advocate for Alberta going on its own for a number of years, long time, and so you're well versed in not only the law as well as the political environment, but you understand the history a lot of this. So Alberta right now is going to amend its Alberta Bill of Rights. Now, I mean, the charter is supposed to be the supreme document, right? The Constitution, which the charter is now embedded as a part of. Now, would it have made it a difference if it was left out of the Constitution? That's one question. And then and the other question would be is how could we make, what can we do? Because you also talk about the Northwest Ordinance, which was an exception made you also talk about the notwithstanding clause, which nobody seems willing to use. What can we do to actually enshrine? Because I think if we enshrine property rights in this Alberta Bill of Rights, I think we have a legitimate fight with the federal government because they don't do that. So I think there might be an opening or an opportunity there to be really, really tough on the language and to be really, really pointed about what we demand and are going to protect here in Alberta because it's completely non-existent on the other side. So what are your thoughts on that?
well, like, I think having property rights in the Bill of Rights is a good thing, but because it's only applies to Alberta and it's only legislation, it's hard to see how it would really restrict the federal government because Alberta can't, enact laws within Alberta's jurisdiction that actually Well, I guess it would depend on particular what the federal government is doing. Like as long as it's within Alberta's jurisdiction, protection for property rights, would be very good. Would definitely have an impact in Alberta. But depending on how the federal government approached a particular issue, that would determine whether those property rights would help or not. You know what I mean? It,
Yeah, I
there's,
just keep
I
thinking
get
though, during COVID, if we had clearly mandated property rights, because I mean, this is being your property, right? Even taking the fight on the gun issue, if you have the right to bear arms, for example, if you're going to go ask for something and really challenge the federal government, like just ask for more, like make it a really big challenge. And then I'd be really curious to see, in light of those kinds of challenges, because I mean, health technically is a provincial jurisdiction, not a federal jurisdiction. So if we have property rights that says, you can't, and it can't only be about protecting the right to choose, because even Justin Trudeau will tell you, well, everybody had the right to choose. No one forced anybody to take a vaccine, and he's not technically wrong. There was coercion, and you had to choose between feeding your family and paying your bills, which is tyranny. But it didn't force you to take the vaccine. So I think there needs to be almost wording in there that's protectionist against punishment for those decisions. You can't be, fired, or you can't be discriminated against or punished for having made that decision. So, but I just really curious, because I wasn't very excited about the Alberta Bill of Rights until I read this book and went, well, maybe there's a loophole. Maybe, every government, when it comes to taxes, every business is always looking for that one gotcha. And I went, well, maybe this is where we can get the federal government on that gotcha.
like it's really hard to say. That's the thing. A lot of it would come down to if there's a particular court case and the kind of judge that the case went before. But I wouldn't put too much hope into it because it is just a provincial legislation. Like the Constitution is the fundamental law, and the Charter is part of the Constitution. Something's got fundamental law. It can't be touched by just one legislature or even the House of Commons. The only way to make a change in the charter officially is through a constitutional amendment, whereas something like the Alberta Bill of Rights, they could make it the best Bill of Rights ever, and then as soon as they don't like some aspect of it, they can just pass changes to it in the legislature because it doesn't have constitutional status, which makes it easy to change. So like the Bill of Rights is a good thing as opposed to a bad thing, but it's still it doesn't have like the strength that something like a constitutional document has, like the charter. Now, you mentioned earlier, if the charter had been left out of the Constitution, that'd be a whole different ballgame, because then it would only apply to the federal government. That like just like Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights, because it was federal legislation, it applied just to the federal government. And Trudeau wanted something that would be enforced on all the provinces. Actually, that was part of his thing. He didn't want something just for the federal government. He wanted to put restrictions on the provincial governments. I mean, it gave there's there's a sense in which the charter was like a national institution that gave more power to Canada as a national institution than over the provinces, if you know what I mean. And in fact, there was discussion about how Trudeau then saw that as a way of generating greater national unity as opposed to provincial unity. Like, because historically Canadians have tended to identify more with their provinces and regions than the national government. Having a charter that supposedly protected everybody, even from their provincial governments, was a way of, at least an attempt, to have people look to the charter as like our central document, the thing that we love the most, more than our provinces, if you know what I mean, to create a deeper national identity. Like, it probably hasn't turned out quite the way that he was expecting, or excuse me, but that is kind of the direction of the charter, that we look to the charter to protect us, not to our provincial governments, right? So to kind of Trudeau was trying to create that more national, centralized kind of viewpoint rather than localized, provincial and regional loyalties.
So you bring up a really good point there, because this really took away the power of the provinces and consolidated it more into the federal government, which the federal government has never stopped. It just keeps moving in that direction more and more, which is why Alberta, it has been fighting back so hard. Because of course it was one thing when they came in, they took our resources. Now they don't even want you to develop those resources. So it's about, one thing to steal the wealth of another province or another nation. It's another thing to actually impoverish them to ensure that they can't even feed their own. And that's what I feel like the federal government has been doing and moving more and more towards. And there has always been this major rift, and the finger that Pierre Trudeau Senior decided to give the West, he truly felt that way, in my belief. He had real resentment for Alberta and the prosperity. And I think, in particular, maybe even the Christian values and the moral standard, that we applied to things here. But on that note, though, because it did take away the power from the parliamentary process and from elected officials who, we can have that discussion as to whether or not they're held accountable these days. We do try. But at least you have the option every 4 years to either, if you didn't approve, vote them out. And he handed that power knowingly over to a judicial system, judges who were appointed. Now, if you know anything about the history of Canada as well, which I know you do, but maybe some of the listeners don't understand, is 2/3 of the time the government is always liberal in this country. The Conservatives seem to be we're fed up with them. They had their 2 terms. They've really made a mess of it. Now the Conservatives come in, they might get a term or 2, and then it's liberal again. So what has been the impact then by taking the power away from the parliamentary, the elected representative, and handing it over to the judges? Because you alluded a little bit to that already.
Yeah, because there's just many policy areas where the judges have taken control, and sometimes even there's been instances where politicians will say to people, "Oh, we can't do anything about that. That's in the court's control." You know what I mean?
I
And
want to
I
bring
think some
that up
politicians.
because
Oh, okay.
Danielle Smith has said that herself. Oh, there's nothing I can do. That is with the courts. And I'm like, when did the courts get more power than our premier?
Yeah, and actually, just to tie in with something you mentioned earlier about the provinces losing power because of the charter, this was one of the reasons why the provincial premiers were so opposed to the charter and why the notwithstanding clause was included. Because I mean, that was the only way. Like Trudeau did not want a notwithstanding clause, and the premiers didn't want a charter. So it was the compromise deal. The Trudeau would get his charter, and the provinces would get the notwithstanding clause. And I know people think the notwithstanding clause it's looked at negatively if it's as if it's overthrowing our charter rights. But the notwithstanding clause is actually part of the charter. It's not in opposition to the charter, it's part of the charter. And it was brought in because the premiers were afraid of the Supreme Court making decisions that were so radical and there was no turning back. And actually, Peter Lougheed, who had been premier at that time, he gave an address which was later published as an article about 1991 at the University of Alberta, where he talked about why it was so important. And one of the examples he gave was actually the Roe v. Wade decision in the United States. Before 1973, the abortion issue in the United States was determined by the states. There were some states that were pro-abortion and they could have pro-abortion laws, and there were some states that were anti-abortion and they could have anti-abortion laws. So it was up to the people. It was up to the state, which if the people of the state wanted the laws or not. It was up to the people. The 1973 Roe v. Wade decision made it a mandated law for the entire United States that they would have abortion on demand. And so there was no compromise there. That's the thing, when you have parliamentarians or politicians discussing issues, they can often come to some kind of a compromise between different positions. And that abortion situation in the United States before 1973 was that, one state goes one way and one the other. Having the courts make a final decision like that cannot be changed, it's not a compromise. It gives complete victory to one side and creates a lot of polarization. Of course, the abortion decision became very polarized in the United States, became a major political issue. And the premiers saw that and they thought, we don't want that kind of situation in Canada. If a court makes a decision that's so extreme like that, we want an opt-out clause so that we can, bring more balance to those kinds of issues and have more of a middle position rather than one extreme or the other. So it was kind of pragmatic in a sense, but the idea was let's give some kind of provision so that we don't allow the courts to make extreme decisions that are going to cause division and problems within the country. You know what I mean? They wanted so the notwithstanding clause hasn't been used very much. It's been used by Quebec the most. I think to protect language laws. It's actually being used right now in Saskatchewan to protect some of the laws regarding transgender policies for children. So and I think Ontario was going to use it a couple of years ago, but there was too much controversy over that because the notwithstanding clause is very controversial, and there's people who want to get rid of it. So it's not used very much, but it is, it's a safety valve when there's an issue that we need politicians to be able to make decisions on, and not just let the courts make those decisions. So the notwithstanding clause, on balance, is probably a good thing. It was considered to be a conservative thing at the time that it was adopted, and so and it's not used that often, so it doesn't seem like it's been causing problems per se. So I think people shouldn't necessarily have a negative view toward the notwithstanding clause, because it was put in there for conservative reasons, as I mentioned. So
Yeah, it sounds like it was put in there for a protection. It was like
yes,
the
yes,
stop the train, the red,
yeah,
don't touch
that's
this
right.
button. Okay, we're not going there, but yet it seems like everybody is so hesitant and resistant to actually use it. And I don't understand sometimes the lack of political will of our politicians, because their primary responsibility should be to put their constituents, their provinces first. So I get, that so many of them are federalists. You hear Danielle say this all the time: a constitutionalist, I'm a federalist. And that bothers me a little bit, because, well, what happens when, you get any centralized planning, whether it be the economy or state or even a city, it's like you've got different people with different ideologies. I mean, the whole purpose for me of government in itself was you were given God-given rights. Government doesn't give you rights. Government was put into place by man to protect the rights that you were granted from a higher authority. In this particular case, Christianity, God, the Christian God, right? Not the multicultural God. But even the multicultural God, I mean, whether you be Muslim, Hindu, like, they all believe in a higher authority. Um,
Yeah.
and so, I look at that and I go, Trudeau knew when he did this, he would hand the power over to the courts to make political decisions. Like, this seems to me to have been deliberately to take away the controversy and to implement these kind of Marxist ideologies, which you've seen Canada just, since 1982. And you touch on that quite a bit here in the book, because if you do remove one moral standard, it has to be replaced by something else. So how do we kind of take that back? Because I firmly believe my rights don't come from government. My rights come from God. The government's job was
Right.
to protect those rights, not
Yeah.
violate them, not determine what they were, not to, interpret them to their liking. So how do we reverse this trend? How do we take back what is what is already ours?
Yeah, actually, just first of all, I mentioned John Locke earlier. He was, the 17th century political philosopher who advocated that our fundamental rights are the right to life, liberty, and property. And he explicitly said our rights come from God, just like you're talking about. If you read John Locke, we have rights because we're created by God. He gave
I
us
think
those
he's
rights.
on this side of
And
my
as
shelf.
Okay. And as you mentioned, like his view, and the purpose of government is to protect those rights. Like, that's why the government is formed, because we have these rights, we want them protected, and so that's the purpose. So when the government's violating that, it's violating its very purpose. Now, it's going to be hard to get back to that, because our the rights that we have, like, we have them in constitutional documents, but when they lose support in the population, it's easy for the government to erode them. And I think that's like our biggest problem, is not just the politicians and the courts and the Constitution, but our fundamentally the beliefs of the individual people have been changing, gradually over the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. So people don't support these same ideas of freedom as they did before. You know what I mean? Like, our politicians actually, to some degree or another, really reflect the voters. So if you're getting socialist politicians elected, that's because the voters are opting for that kind of thing. You know what I mean? So the fundamental problem is always the grassroots problem, that educating people to understand these issues. And it's not in the interest of politicians for them to understand these issues often. And so it's we need to get the information out, because if people don't understand these issues, they can't vote for the people who support freedom. They'll end up voting for people, like socialist politicians often promise goodies. You know what I mean? Like, their idea is to have a bigger government, higher taxes, and they have goodies, and so they're going to offer people goodies. Vote for me and you'll get these goodies. And and people will go for that. You know what I mean? And so with Trudeau is offering like pharmacare, something like that. You know, anyway, other kinds of welfare programs like these. If you support me, I'll give you more free stuff. You know, that's what it comes down to, right? Often with left wing politicians, and people will vote for that. Like, why? You know, if people don't understand the issue, why wouldn't they vote for more free stuff? If one politician offers, well, generally what you have, you know, this is generally speaking, but you usually have a party on the right that's offering tax cuts and less services, and a party on the left that's offering, you know, they
Mm.
won't say hard taxes, but that's what it is, and goodies. So, are you going to vote for the tax cuts, or are you going to vote for the goodies? And sometimes people will vote for one or the other. But you know, there are people who, you know, if you come to them and say, here's these free programs you'll get if you vote for me, lots of people will vote for that. You know what I mean? And so people vote themselves into socialism in a sense, like at least gradually over time. That's kind of, we've had a huge growth of government since the time of Pierre Trudeau. You know, he was a major turning point in Canadian history, and since then our government has just been getting bigger and bigger, and you know, with more and more programs, and people have been voting for it. You know, not consistently every election necessarily, but in general over a period of time. So the fundamental problem is the grassroots problem of people, you know, not understanding that we're going to lose our freedoms if we keep voting for bigger government ultimately.
Yeah, well, I think if you follow the history, you understand the Fabian Society at all. They coined the term social democracy, right? They don't call it Fabianism, they don't call it Marxism anymore. It's social democracy. And they understood that people would vote themselves out of their freedoms by offering these little tidbits and goodies, you know. And it's the dog on the chain, or the frog in the hot water, right? Just turn it up a degree, a degree, a degree. It's really interesting. I did a little video the other day, and I talked about how Alberta is increasing the land titles fees. And it's a 250% increase. And people go, oh, it's going up from $100 to $500. Whoop-de-doo. And I went, see, there you go. It is a whoop-de-doo, because if we don't fight the little things add up to big things. And that's the problem. We have been guilty of doing this to ourselves in eroding away our own freedoms. And I don't think it's been done intentionally. Like, people honestly don't realize what has happened, because politicians are, in my opinion, less than honest about their intentions. Am I wrong in saying that?
No, like, I
um,
mean, for me, I mean, I make a generalization that, you know, when people are seriously running for office, their highest priority is to win. And so if they have to, you know, fudge something, if that increases their chances of winning, I think a lot of them will do that. I think that's the incentive. You know what I mean? If you can, you know, say things in a particular way to convince people of something that might not be entirely true, but if it increases your chances of winning, you know, it might be worth it. So, you know, I don't know how many. Well, I'm assuming there's some principled politicians around, but there's others that are more interested in their, I think, their personal careers and getting ahead. That's a higher priority than being 100% honest.
Yeah, and I think that's been a big problem. I have been very outspoken about the fact that, I mean, I think the best system is that where independence, there is no party politics, because at least then you represent your constituents, not the party first. And I think the fact that, accountability should be a promise made is a promise kept. And if you don't keep those promises, one of the policies we've been advocating in at 1905 is within 24 months, you have to come back under a leadership review to explain as to why you didn't keep those promises. And people have the decision then to make whether or not, okay, that's justified or it's not. Either you stay or you go. So, the lack of accountability, I think, politically has been a huge issue. But I think Pierre Elliott Trudeau understood that when he put the charter into play, and he was trying to take away some of these controversial issues. And I think he had an agenda when he did that. Like, truly here, you talk about the judges are only implementing the vision of Canada established by the charter. I think you're right about that. And then when you think about just recently, yesterday, New Brunswick, a liberal government. I'm like, of all the scandals, everything that has gone on around the Liberal Party federally, to have a province vote for a liberal government right now, I just was gobsmacked. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. How does this happen? And Danielle has come out with another $8.6 billion. She's going to dedicate this to building schools. And, sounds great. But I mean, as somebody who homeschools my daughter, I really loved her education voucher because that would allow me to choose the education that I would deem appropriate for my child, whether it be a Christian education or a charter school, or to continue to homeschool her with the values that are important to me and my family. And I love that idea. What happened to that idea? It's like, can we get that back on the map? So what would be like give me like three things that people could do today to start reversing this course, get people to start thinking about how do we regain our rights and freedoms. I mean, I think first off, we have to acknowledge that they don't come from government. Government's job was to protect them. They don't, if government is giving you something, it's called a privilege. And I think you put a really good point on the fact that even if Danielle amends the Bill of Rights, the next government could turn around and amend it or change it back or do something different with it. So what are three things we could do?
Well, actually, the first thing that comes to mind and is actually we need to turn back to God. Like I'm serious about that. Like without that, we're not going to be able to recover. Like our historically in Canada and in Alberta in particular in the mid 20th century, many Albertans looked to God and believed in God. Were dedicated Christians, and I think without a return to God, there isn't any rebuilding of our society the way it used to be. Like we used to be historically a Christian society. That's where our rights and freedoms came from. Like all the most prosperous countries in the world, whether it's the United States or Britain or Australia, they all had this Christian foundation. And so there has to be a serious return to that Christian foundation as the fundamental thing, if we're going to get back to any of the kinds of freedoms that we had before. So that's the fundamental, the most fundamental thing. On top of that, then people would have to learn the implications of that in terms of you know, the philosophy behind it, like even talking about like John Locke and how he explains that as creatures of God, we have individual rights, and that the government's role is to protect those rights. And so people would need to learn that kind of stuff. Like not necessarily from him. There's actually many good books out there that talk about the basic foundation of the freedom philosophy, and individual rights. So people would have to really learn that material for themselves so they understand how that you know how that impacts the rights that we have and the political system. And then thirdly, I guess for people to kind of encourage their friends and neighbors and family to also look into these things. It's got to be a widespread thing. I mean, each of us has to start with ourselves individually, and hopefully we can help to explain to other people the importance of these things and maybe bring them on board. You know what I mean? It's got to start with us as individuals, but we have to win many people over to the freedom ideals in order to restore the freedoms in our society. So it's really comes down to us as individuals beginning that way, because it's not just a matter of voting one person in. You know what I mean? Like there are some good people in different places, who would be good to have them in power, but it's not good enough to have one leader. We can't just put our confidence into one person, because one person, might be there for a few years, and maybe they'll do some good for a few years, but then they're going to be gone, and there'll be another person who's not so good. You know what I mean? So I mean, like I say, it's good to have a good person in power, but it's not sufficient. You can't put your confidence in a politician or a leader or even an organization and say, well, this is the salvation. This is the solution we need, is to get this party in or this person, and then we're okay. Because it won't be okay. It's the kind of thing you got to keep working on every day. Freedom isn't something that you vote on once and it's in and you've got it. You know what I mean? It's something you have to work on all the time, because it doesn't go away overnight, and it can't be restored overnight. It's got to be a long-term process of working hard every day. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And in your book, Time to Leave, you talk about, I think, Mitika, who was a leftist professor, right? To quote,
Yes.
he said, for progressives, freedom is a problem and must be restricted.
Yes.
And I mean, so this is what
Yes.
we're up against, right? As people who want freedom, is we are up against people who honestly think that freedom is a problem, right? You can't
Yep.
be free
Yep.
to make your decisions. You can't be free to say what's actually on your mind or to debate an
Yep.
idea
Yep.
that's controversial. And this is what's led us into the problem we're in. And every communist country is atheist, right? There is no belief in any God, right? That's been
Right.
outlawed.
Right.
That's not allowed. So, there is no
Yep.
freedom of religion, no freedom of conscience, no freedom of thought, no freedom of, but one of the things I do want to talk to a little bit here, because you mentioned this again in the Leaving God Behind, um, Secularism must maintain a monopoly in the public life. So many Christians in particular opt not to get involved in politics. They do not want to cast a ballot. And so that leaves this huge void of people who manipulate and use the system to their advantage because they don't want to get involved, right? What do you say to that? Because that is so true. Like the church, secularism, you said it, the church is to be tolerated by the state only insofar as it relinquishes its claim on the public square. This is what's got to stop.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And Alberta's history, as I mentioned earlier, during the mid 20th century, Alberta had two premiers who were radio preachers at the same time, like Bible Bill Aberhart. He formed the Social Credit Party and was elected in 1935. When he died in 1943, he was replaced by Ernest Manning, who was the second longest serving premier in Canadian history. They were both radio preachers at the same time as they were premiers. They were very well known evangelical leaders in Alberta, and they were doing, religious ministry and leading the government at the same time. And this was okay. They never lost an election because this was widely accepted in Alberta at that time that it was okay to be a Christian and be involved in politics. Like this was kind of the norm. Like that's back when Alberta was known as the Bible Belt of Canada, because we had this strong, Christian religious influence in the provincial government for decades. And I bring that up to encourage Christians to realize that this is something that has been normal in Alberta and to some degree in Canada over our history. And we're being led to believe that there's something wrong with Christians being involved. In fact, there's an example back in July, Pierre, just as an example, he went to some evangelical churches and there was a scandal in the media. How dare Pierre Poilievre go to these evangelical churches? He's trying to mix religion and politics. And Brian Lilly from the Toronto Sun pointed out they don't complain when Poilievre goes to a mosque. They don't complain when Poilievre goes to a gurdwara or a temple or anything like that. They only complain when he goes to evangelical church because the leftists, they say they're against religion and politics, but they're not against religion and politics. They're against just Christianity and politics because these other things are okay. They're okay with, Muslims are citizens too, and they can be involved, or, Sikhs can be involved, they're citizens too. But evangelical Christians, whoa, what are you guys doing? You shouldn't be involved in politics. So we get that negative message, and Christians need to realize that it's not true. And the leftists are not even consistent in it because they're only opposed to some people and not others. So Christians should realize that they have every right as a citizen of Canada to participate just as much as anybody else, and they have just as much right to bring their beliefs into the political square as anybody else. There's no law or provision or anything that there's one group of people who aren't allowed to, bring their values into politics, and that's Christians. That's kind of what the left wants us to believe, but there's absolutely nothing like that. It's kind of like they're stripping us or trying to strip us of our rights as citizens when they tell us that we shouldn't be involved or that we shouldn't bring our beliefs into politics. It's completely unfair and completely untrue.
Well, how do you separate the person? Like if this is who I am. What you see is what you get. I can't.
Right, right,
That's a facade. Then you're wearing a mask. You're not being truthful or honest. But you
right.
bring up a
Actually,
point. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, can I just make it? I just make it. I want to make a distinction here that a lot of people I don't think have heard. Like people talk about the separation of church and state, and that's a good thing. Like the state is an institution with particular leaders, and the church is a particular institution with leaders, and those two institutions need to be separate because they are supposed to be separate. But there's a difference between that and separating religion from politics, because you cannot separate religion from politics, because religion just basically refers to people's fundamental beliefs. So you might be a Christian or a Muslim or Sikh, or you might be a secularist. Like secularists don't want to think of their beliefs as religion, but it functions every bit as much of religion. It's beliefs that they have, about the nature of life and reality and so on. So when secularists bring their beliefs into the political square, it's no different from Christians bringing their beliefs into the political square, because you can never separate religion and politics. They're always linked together. So that's the separation of church and state is a completely different idea than the separation of religion and politics. And religion and politics are never separated and can't be separated.
So on that note, because I think like when we go back to the 1960s, when we saw a shift away from religion in schools and religion in politics and those types of things, and we have had Canada is built upon it is very multicultural, it is very diverse in who is here, but so many people came here because Christianity is so very tolerant. and accepting of other cultures. And I think it's very important. Like I really became um, excited about this when I realized that there is no greater legal system than what was in Canada prior to 1982, when the protections did come from God. It wasn't what some man or woman decided on a whim. It wasn't some progressive. And this is what bothers me a little bit even today with the Conservative Party. These progressive conservatives, like, can that exist? Can you be a progressive and a conservative? Because I don't think you can.
No, no, you're
And
right. I mean, yeah, it's a contradiction, right? Progressive conservative are opposite terms, and often in the past, the term progressive conservative as a party label would refer to red Tories, who were people who were kind of, well, they might be conservative in some respects, but overall they weren't much different from the Liberals or the NDP in terms of their fundamental perspectives. So definitely progressive conservative is a contradiction, and it's often being used to tell people with real conservative beliefs to be quiet. Specifically, there's a number of Christian MPs in the Conservative Party, and they're told to shut up. They don't. The Conservative Party does not want them to speak their beliefs. They want them to be quiet and just serve as pawns for the party. You know what I mean? And it's because the progressive perspective within the Conservative Party, they want that progressive perspective to be dominant in the media, at least, so that people will, the Conservative Party doesn't have to deal with any controversial issues.
yeah, one of the things I keep pointing out to people now, because so many people are challenging me on, me being so tough a little bit here on our premier, because I said, where are all the liberals in this province? Where are the liberals hiding? Because provincially, we don't have a liberal party. So they have to be somewhere, So where are they exactly? I draw the line between, okay, well, I'm fiscally conservative, but I'm socially progressive. That's called being liberal, right? Just because you want to balance a budget doesn't make you a conservative, right? Especially if all your
Mhm.
social policies are progressive. That you're a liberal. So, but then you've got I think they're in the progressive conservative camp. Oh, I'm fiscally
Mhm.
conservative, but I'm socially progressive. And that cracks me up, because so call yourself what you are. I'm a liberal, right? But this is where I'm hiding behind the blue coat. And then if you are not fiscally conservative, you're like, hey, print more money. Let's just go balls to the wall on spending and social programs, and who cares? Those are your NDPers, right? That's the
Yeah,
complete,
yeah.
train heading, well, I think we've already arrived to communism, right? That's full on Marxist. So, and then I think the progressive conservatives call themselves, because they don't want to call themselves liberals. They're like, it's almost like they're trying to convince themselves otherwise. But I find it interesting, because we do have a lot of immigrants in this country, though. So many people, I think, would feel that if we went back to being that Christian country, that maybe their rights might be infringed upon. What do you say to that?
Like, I don't think so. I mean, I think when you look back at Canada before 1982, it doesn't seem to me that people's rights were being infringed upon. Like, it seemed like a very free and happy society. And like, even at that time, there were people from all over the world pouring into Canada in the 1970s. If they thought that this was a country that was violating rights, it doesn't make any sense that they would have been coming here. And that was before the charter. So it doesn't. I can't see why Canada turning back to its more freedom-oriented Christian roots would be, lead to any kind of rights violation at all.
Yeah, I think if anything, it would lead to greater protection for everybody, everybody who calls
Mhm.
themselves a Canadian and who lives here. Um, I think we pretty much covered all the. I mean, I still have lots of stickies, but I think we kind of touched on the big ones. Any last words or last thoughts that you'd leave people with?
Can I just bring up, you mentioned Matiga. I think his name was Ross Matiga, a
Yes.
professor who was talking about climate change that I quote in Time to Leave. And I just want to bring that up for context. Matiga, he's a professor in Chile, but he's actually an American. He was a Democratic Party activist in Virginia. So he reflects like American progressive ideology. And he wrote an article for the American Political Science Review that I quote in my book, and it's a very prestigious journal that he wrote for, and he was very honest about it, as you mentioned, how when dealing with climate change, progressives see freedom as a problem because if you have freedom, people can speak against climate change policies, and that's so he's proposing different kinds of policies to deliberately restrict freedom so that people can't oppose climate change policy. But this is kind of a you know, it's good that someone can be so honest about it, so we know the kind of direction that some of these people are thinking. Some of these major progressives are thinking about how they're openly talking about restricting our freedoms as a way of addressing the climate change problem. So I just wanted to throw that context in because I think his article is very significant. He's a significant person, and on top of that, all I would just want to mention, if it's okay, if I can mention that my books are available at a website called merchantship.ca. That's a Didsbury-based family business. So you're helping a family business if you go there. So the business is called Merchant Ship, and their website is merchantship.ca. And if you search my name there, the books that we talked about would be available there.
And many more books. I strongly, anybody who's listening, and I have actually, I was at the for times such as these, and I think I promoted your book more than I promote. Your lovely wife was sitting over there with all your books. I'm like, you need to go buy these books in particular. So, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Well, it was really funny that you mentioned that because even, in the U.S., for our U.S. listeners, Kamala Harris, and J.D. Vance, both of them, Jesus is King came up. And it was funny because it just, get blurted out of the crowd. And, J.D. Vance's response was, yes, Jesus is King. And Kamala Harris was, you're at the wrong rally.
Yep. Yep.
And that is truly the difference between this progressive left woke ideology, this train that, I think Canada really just needs to abandon. And I think that is going to take such tremendous political pressure because politicians just, they do. It's about them getting elected and then staying elected. It's not about necessarily the citizens and doing what's right. Otherwise, and it is about principles. And this is the one thing, like people have challenged me right now, and it is about principles. Leaders are going to come and go. I right now I'm challenging Danielle Smith, but you know what? Whether it's Danielle Smith or someone else is irrelevant, right? It's about the actions. It's about the policies. It's about the principles. Let's get back to those solid, sound principles because you know what? We wouldn't need a single principle or a policy in government if we could just adhere to our own principles. The United Conservative Party, for example, has a beautiful statement of principles. And when I challenged those during COVID, they're just mere suggestions. And I'm like, well, then don't call them principles. Oh, they don't have to adhere to them. And I'm like, then why the heck did you bother to write them down and call them a principle? So I really, do you have any hope that we can turn this province around?
Like in the long term, like I do have, as I mentioned, I do think ultimately that people will turn back to God at some point. Like that's what I think. I don't know the future. I'm not a prophet, but that's my hope that at some point there will be a return to God, and that's the only way this province and this country, can get restored to a more prosperous and free future.
Wow. I think we're going to be waiting a while.
It could be, yes. Yeah.
I think so. Well, Michael, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And I think we'll do it again for sure. If you're willing to put up with my, sticky notes. Thank you so very much. Have a great night. And, we will, if there's anything that comes up, anybody who's looking to buy Michael's books, again, merchantship.ca, they are definitely worth reading. And it's not just Leaving God Behind and Time to Leave. Both are excellent, more recent books, but you've also got others there as well. So please do go check him out. Support him and his 11 children. Come on now. It's like he's got a lot of mouths to feed. I'm sure lots of them have left home by now, but The reality is the information there, the fact is there. I'm about critical thinking, and it's about, you got to think a little bit outside the box, or at least expand the box a little bit. And that's really what you challenge people to do in your books. So thank you so much for that. And, God bless you. Don't change one little bit, and stay in the fight, because one of the big disappointments for me just recently was the Alberta Prosperity Project kind of reversed its stance a little bit, because it's always been very much a separatist party. And I called
Mhm.
Dennis Modry and I said, what the heck? You're not a separatist party anymore. They're trying to be this more inclusive, camp for everybody who just wants greater sovereignty. And I'm like, well, when you've got a scale like this, the only way to rebalance that scale is to apply so much pressure the other way. I said, you were that. And
Yeah.
now, trying to be everything to everyone, you'll accomplish nothing. And you're actually hurting the cause. That was my opinion. But
Mhm. Mhm.
this is what happens in Alberta. We try to be something for everybody, and even government. You can't do that. I think Danielle Smith, for example, is losing her base. Why? Because she's trying to appease the left and trying to find some middle ground where none really exists. Progressive conservatives, which is that's not conservative, and she's leaving behind the truly conservative voter. And she's putting them in a really bad situation where it's like, well, I have no one to vote for. And people become disillusioned and disheartened and often just give up. So
Mhm.
hopefully, don't give up. I think if anything tonight, that's the message. Don't give up, stick it out, get out and vote, and be a part of the process. Make sure your voice is being heard. And that means that the responsibility is on you as an individual to speak your truth, to speak the truth, because your truth is not objective. There is a right and a wrong. So I went on again. I ramble, I know, but there's so many things to say. We'll end it there. Thank you again so much, Michael. I very much appreciate it. And, please do, everybody who's listening, go check out Michael's books.
Thank you so much, Nadine. It's been great to be on here. Thank you so much.